Welcome to Team Talk from Team Kinetic with me, Chris Martin.
And me, Imo Greatbatch. Team Talk is the podcast that dives deeper into the world of volunteer management, getting to know the people who help make volunteering happen, why they do it, how they do it, and what they want to see change. If you are new to listening to the podcast, a big warm welcome to you. But if you've listened before, welcome back.
So this week we're joined by Danielle Hogan. She is the Diversity and Belonging Business Partner from England Netball. We're also joined by Richard Evans, who is the Strategic Lead for Disability at England Netball. So welcome to the show, guys.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, same.
And Danielle, Rich, welcome to Team Talk. This is very exciting as a fellow colleague coming on the podcast. Thank you for coming. But this season, we really wanted to feature guests who could help us explore inclusion and accessibility needs to embed great experiences. So I'm really excited that we can kind of start to explore how and what your roles are and what's happening in netball to try and drive some of that inclusion and what is belonging, Danielle. I'm really excited to get into kind of what that is and how we kind of can create that sense of belonging in sport.
Definitely going to come back to the word belonging because I think it's such an interesting term to use in a job description. It's really keen to sort of dig a bit deeper into that in a while. But we always like to start the pod off by getting to know our guests a little bit and trying to understand where they've come from and how they've, the journey that's brought them to where they are currently and how their personal journey has been impacted by volunteering themselves and where that's brought you to in sort of your current working life. So I guess we'll go ladies first. Danielle, your journey is not the classic sports development journey by any stretch of the imagination. Yours is from a psychology background and working in business to England Netball. It's a slightly unusual journey by the normal sports development officers that we've talked to. Tell us a little bit about sort of how you've come to England Netball, but the route you took to get here.
First of all, good morning. Are we still at morning? Yeah, good morning, Chris and Imo. Yeah, just about. It feels like I've had a whole working day already. So, but yeah, unusual, I guess. I mean, I'm starting to feel that and see that a little bit now. The more people that I speak to, most people have been like sport, and they perhaps have gone from one governing body to another, or they've worked for various organizations or charities in sport. But I think it's almost, for me, it's my worlds have collided perfectly because my background is in business psychology, but I've always played netball and always been a huge fan of basketball and I guess a bit of footy, but basketball and netball have been my whole life. Both parents are players and coaches and tutors and coach educators, and so I've grown up, even though my parents were never together. I grew up with just my mum. Both of them, if I did tap into my dad, it'd be on the side of a basketball court, or we did go for lunch and he'd be taking calls about athletes. And so it was always like my life has always been sport outside of any work. So I guess although it might seem a little different, it's almost like that perfect mix now of work, but in sport.
There's a couple of interesting things there for me. The idea of the significant others in your upbringing being impactful in what you end up doing in terms of your love for sport. I certainly sort of have a similar kind of experience with my mum and dad. A lot of our time was spent in and around doing, for me, in my case, it was swimming. But,
Oh, so you were up early in the morning then, Chris?
My mum still off for that, to be fair. 3 days a week at 5 a.m. in Hogan swimming bath. Freezing cold in the middle of winter. It was awful. I'm not going to lie. But, when we think about volunteering, I don't know if there's any research out there on it. And maybe you guys may know more about it than me, but seeing your parents be involved in it like that, the impact that has on you, I think is quite, maybe it's we underestimate that sometimes. And when we're trying to encourage people to volunteer, whether they appreciate, what you've seen is what you do, what you see what you see, and then you thought, I don't know, you got any thoughts on any of that?
Asking me, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think what's interesting, and we probably would get onto that a bit further, but I was thinking about this. You don't see it as volunteering.
No.
That's the thing. You just see it as that's what people do, and that's what we all do. But you're volunteering. Like, I'm coaching now, but I'm a volunteer, and honestly, as naive as this sounds, of course, if anybody really broke it down to me, I'm doing something, I'm not getting paid for it. Yep. But I wouldn't be thinking that I'm a volunteer. And I've joined England Netball, and now I'm like, we need to fly the flags for volunteers. Like, the word volunteering is this huge, and I think coming back off the Commonwealth Games for me and seeing that obviously they've got the money and the rest of it to make that experience what it was. But those volunteers felt like they belonged, and there was a whole program designed. Like, being a volunteer was the best thing ever. People took annual leave to be a volunteer. It really motivated me, and like meeting Imo and the amazing work that Imo does, and then really recognizing that everybody all my life in netball, literally all my life since I was born, my mum was playing netball, they've all been volunteers. It's like been this this moment where I've been like, oh my gosh. Like, obviously I know it.
The sports volunteer piece as well is always interesting for me, because in sort of the more traditional volunteer setting, it is a bit clearer. You are a bit more cause driven often, whereas in sport, you're driven by the sport primarily, and often because your kids are involved in that sport. So it's a slightly different relationship. And I think why sport finds it very hard to, not very hard, but often don't recognize the volunteer in the same way. There's sort of like just an assumption that, the volunteers do what they do. And like you say, the world's changing around us in terms of the demands on people's attention, what people have access to and what they can do as considered leisure time. And this idea of volunteering, it's not just something you do, it's not something you buy, it's not something you consume, it's something you actively have to be involved in and take part in. And I think, like you said, that belonging piece for for those big events are great. But I sometimes worry that those big events are sort of almost consumerized volunteering. It's a little package thing, you get lots of nice free stuff. Turn up and whereas, sports volunteering in its more traditional form is some poor soul's got to be on that committee. Somebody's got to be that treasurer. So, that.
Yeah. But I feel like this is like a really good segue to move for Rich, because I feel like you've got Danielle, I always get so motivated listening to you, and I'm really excited, and I'm so pleased like our worlds have joined together. But this cause-related volunteering versus kind of then just created journey because of your circumstance, whether you were on the side of a pitch and no one was volunteering. So I've got onto it. It's really interesting. And Rich, you've come from a physiotherapy at University of Tyneside, strategic lead for disability and netball. And your career's been quite focused on the inclusion of people with disabilities. But also you have this fantastic world as a volunteer in boccia, which is a completely different sport. Tell us a bit about your journey and kind of the cerebral palsy sport talent manager role and all of the different things that have brought you to your role in England Netball.
Yeah, okay. I think significant others, going back to that theme that Danielle brought, was key, as a key catalyst for me. My parents in particular. My dad was involved in disability sport his whole life. He's another therapist as well, even down to in the family setting, the way that we were a respite care family for parents who had children with a disability to give them a weekend break. So I've literally been brought up in a volunteer kind of role, even down to the church settings and the kind of roles you'd have in a church setting and things. As I matured and grew up, my volunteering I can remember the day I started volunteering. It was a Northeast Championships at Nissan on Sunderland, who there's a big factory in Nissan in Sunderland, and there was a boccia competition. Boccia is a Paralympic sport played by people with some of the highest level of physical disabilities. And the way it started was my dad simply saying, "Oh, if you do this, you get a day off school." And I was like, "Yes."
It's all about incentive. It's all about incentive.
So he found that button and he pushed it. And that was it. And I was 15 years old and loved it. I loved the sense of freedom, but also that maturity that you get, and regardless of your age, because of the role you take on. Ever since then, I was then involved in the sport from literally my first international competition. I was just a runner. I would just go and get the lunches. I would just do. But I was a part of the team, and a part of talking about belonging. We can think about belonging from a national governing body perspective, which is probably what we're talking about today. But I think I felt that belonging within that environment, with the people that I had. Did I link to the national governing body at the time? Not particularly, but I absolutely had a place in that team. And that kind of just grew, and I went through university and ended up going down the officiating route to becoming an international referee. And I also do the same in power chair football as well, which is, again, it's football with electric wheelchairs. Think a little bit like Dodgems, something similar like that. It's a FIFA sport. I'm a classifier there, so I look at people's different levels of functional ability. So I use my physio skills a bit more in that area. But I think all the way through my journey as a non-traditional physio, I've always worked in a sports setting. Ultimately, in order to do anything, volunteers have been central. It's just a standard, an assumption, and I think that's maybe where sometimes, maybe volunteers are undervalued, because there is that assumption that's made, because they have to be there in order to make something happen. So I continued in that role. I continued in Paralympic sports. I worked for the national governing body of boccia, called Boccia England. I ended up at England Netball, actually, as a little bit of a bet, to be honest, because I never quite understood why netball didn't really have a disability offer. And a friend of mine, Lauren Templeton, who used to work for England Netball and now works for GB Wheelchair Rugby, we talked about this for years. Like, why isn't there a disability offer? Anyway, the job came up. She sent it to me and said, you got to put your money where your mouth is. And that's how I actually ended up at England Netball, not really knowing much about netball, which I was very honest about in my interview. I didn't bluff anyone. I said, don't know netball, but I do know disability. And then over the last few years, again, in an area of the sport which relies so heavily on volunteers, it's grown and grown and grown, and the need and the requirement and the want from the volunteering sector to be more involved in this area. Often we give those volunteers an opportunity and they soak it up and they want to do more.
It brings us nicely on to the next question, which is, what are the challenges for sports to make them more inclusive, be it from people with different backgrounds, or be it for people with different disabilities? Why do we think sport has often found this so challenging? What are your thoughts on the challenges that? No, I'm not thinking netball specifically here, but more generally, why does sport find this challenge being more open and inclusive? What are the issues behind that? What are the underlying issues? Is it just a wider societal thing and sport reflects that? Or is there certain things that are intrinsic in sort of the club nature of sport that makes it a little bit more closed shop sometimes to people? I don't know. I'd just be interested to see what your thoughts are as to the sort of the broader challenges you think that sports face.
Wow, amazing question. I wish we knew the answer. I don't think, and again, I can only speak really from my perspective and from the work that I've been involved in. And I think we've got such a way to go, but I also think, as you said, it's very reflective of society in general when we're talking about inclusion. And I think that it goes back to the point around belonging, that you connect and feel like you belong when you're in a collective and when you're connected to people that are like you. It's almost like when those in sport, when those opportunities haven't been there, or where you don't see it, then we're not growing it. We're not going to change anything. People want to feel like they belong. But I feel optimistic, because I feel like we see Rich must talk and feel this way, much a connection to this more than me, from his experience, much more than mine. But in terms of disability and parasport, wow, what we've seen in the last few years has been the growth in terms of what we see. I'm not necessarily talking about grassroots or what really is going on, but in terms of what we see,
because there's been a cultural change, I think, around it, that it's no longer frowned upon or shunned or put on the side. It's sort of held up as an example of elite sport. When you have the Paralympics, granted only every 4 years, but there has definitely been it feels like there has been a culture change.
There has. I feel like there's a little bit there where we need to be careful, and it's the same. It is the representation versus inclusion, and we can represent and we can show that there are people with disabilities on TV, on Strictly Come Dancing, on and we can offer a para competition at the Commonwealth Games, and we can show Black athletes on marketing campaigns and whatever. But there's the inclusion and understanding the needs and really including those people from marginalized groups. That's where we've still got the challenge. I mean, we have to start somewhere, and I'm proud of where we're trying to move to as a society. And I'm proud that my children are brought up in where on TV watching a para competition is just no different. It's just what it is. That I've got kids that are seeing that, and for Rich with his daughters as well must feel the same. Or you know, that we've got a black dancer on Strictly, because my girls dance a bit.
Yep.
We all dabble a little bit. But would see, you know, a black female dancer, professional dancer on Strictly win for 2 years. Like, we are representing some minority groups here and some marginalized groups.
You can see you can be it. It's that kind of feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's an inclusion piece that is different to that.
Yeah.
I think you're right. And I think there's a difference as well between then the experience that they have once they are volunteering and how that differs. There's some great research by Activity Alliance on disability volunteers, and actually deaf and disabled people are more likely to volunteer than non-disabled people, but also the experience that they have, they're much more likely to have a negative experience in that volunteering role. So it's not just about getting them to volunteer to get them to start, it's also then the experience that they have and the barriers that they have once that volunteering role has been found. And I guess that's almost the belonging part. How do you make that volunteering role sticky?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually thinking about the participation side, but Rich, you're totally right. As we talked before about what we see our significant others doing, it's not so much just about seeing people play, it's about being reflected throughout the organisation, and the organisation being sensitive to the particular needs of various individuals and their particular circumstance. You're right. It's one thing to have somebody playing. It's another thing to see a person from a marginalised group as the chair of the organisation, or in a traditional leadership role. That lived experience then being reflected through sort of the culture of the organisation. I've not sort of thought that far down that line, but yeah, I think you're totally right. Having a disabled volunteer isn't necessarily the same as having that person's lived experience reflected in the culture of the organisation. That sort of difference between tokenism of having that person volunteering in a very basic capacity versus that person having some kind of leadership role. So yeah, it's really some very interesting thought.
Activity Alliance, they are the Sport England quangos. They look after all of the disability within the national governing body sports, so they cover all of us, and it's called Encouraging More Disabled People to Volunteer in Sport, and it was released about, I think it was 2017 2018, and yeah, it's a really important document that looks at the numbers, but also the barriers, but also where they are to how people are treated, sometimes the difference and the costs in order for them to volunteer. The cost for a disabled person in order to get to a place where they volunteer, whether that's transport or personal care issues, that much wider perspective. So I think to kind of merge the two of participation and in volunteering, I think many of them from a disabled person's point of view, the barriers are actually quite similar. The barriers to volunteering, in whether that's a entry level position or it's a committee, will actually be quite similar to those whether you're playing sport. So yeah, it's a really good piece, and they often, just to give Activity Alliance a shout out, they often have supporting documents as well that talk through actually how they did the research too. So if people want to do a deep dive, then it's absolutely possible to do so.
And I think this is really interesting, kind of, Rich, and where you talk about participation and then volunteering. The two are absolutely interdependent, because we cannot grow participation across the country to kind of address the inactivity levels that are talked about in Sport England strategy, unless we also consider the growth and that inclusion by design from the start of people who give their time, because the infrastructure of paid workforce just will never be able to facilitate the numbers that we need to kind of encourage activity. And I guess a key question for me, kind of bringing it back to netball, is you've both got two quite distinct roles. How and netball have gone into this new adventure with quite a clear purpose around leading a movement on and beyond the court, upholding that unapologetic focus on women and girls, but also whilst opening the game for new audiences to belong, flourish and soar. So how do your two roles work within that, and what sort of things do you do, Rich, around inclusion and the vehicles for people to feel engaged and included in netball? And Danielle, I know you've only been in since September last year, but sort of what sort of things are you driving create that sense of belonging in netball?
I think to a certain extent, the honest answer is we're still working it out. Where is that line? And not that it has to be distinctive. I think actually to have a little bit of overlap is healthy and is good. I think my area is probably a bit more, I guess, getting the numbers to play, or in this case, two volunteers, the actual the physical funnels to increase participation, and what then that might look like when it comes to on the ground from a support point of view, from a barriers point of view. So I guess the strategy, the Para Netball strategy, which we released several years ago, was very much about how do we go from 300 odd people, I think it was 342 people with a disability within England Netball. How do we increase that? And we now have around 5,000 a year. We're now the largest team sport for women with deaf and disabilities, having just taken over from the FA, which is great. Sport England's figures, not mine, so that it's not me twisting them. That very much around that practical application as to how do we move someone from not doing something to doing something.
Well, when Imo started asking Rich, I suddenly thought, is this for Imo's own, when she's writing her strategies and then she's leading on all these strategies at work, Imo's trying to make sure that she's got it quite clear in her mind. And I'm glad Rich gave an honest answer that there's such a crossover, there's a crossover, but there's also, we are figuring it out. Like, of course, it's the start of a new year, and we really kind of digging deep, I guess, into that a little bit to try and put some structure that's really just differentiate us. But at the same time, Rich and I always, as we have, has been a complete ally to me since I've started at England Netball, and we'll cross over. I'm always tapping into Richard's apostrophe S amazing knowledge and his motivation in the space. Like, he's been brilliant for me. I've really enjoyed working with Rich, and that will never change. I'll always be ringing him up for ideas and to tap into his brain. But I think, as Rich said, it's quite, focused on the numbers and increasing engagement, increasing participation. And then I think where I come in is then behind the scenes. Like, when people do then come in and we do increase numbers, the people that we've already got in our organisation, how are they ensuring that those people are feeling like they belong? What do those people know? How do they engage with people from communities that they have never worked with or played with or had dinner with, and that's the gap. That's what's happening. So we might get people in, and I want to make sure that then when we are getting more numbers and we are increasing participation for the benefit of those who are participating, which is my first thing, but obviously for our organisation it's also important, it's theirs as well, but it's also important that we're getting numbers in and we get that support to keep us going. But when we do engage with minority or marginalized groups, when they then connect to our sport and the people in it, what then happens? How are those people supported and geared up to working with communities? We can't just stick community officers or people in areas and volunteers in areas and say we want to increase participation for this group, and those people don't know how to even talk to that group or what their needs might be of that group. And that's where I see my key priorities for the start of this year and moving forward.
It's a really interesting one. You both sort of touched upon it about inclusion, getting people into your existing. What's your thoughts around this idea of creating spaces for people from the marginalised groups to have their own clubs and their own, is it about including people in the existing structures, or about creating new structures that account for differences, if that makes sense? Is it sort of include them in the wider sport but in their own space, or is it about including them in the same space that already exists? What are your thoughts around that kind of argument?
It's a little bit of an existential crisis, or a common question, really, because are we doing things which are inclusive, bringing everyone together, or are we doing something tailored and specific? Now, my world in disability, we've toyed and we yo-yo between these two things massively, and the reality is that we want to do both. I think we have to recognize that as a national governing body, but just as a sport, we need to be bringing in more people of a wider demographics in order to enjoy the sport. So we need to make our offers more accessible, more inclusive. However, there is also a place to recognize cultural differences, different barriers, and to do something purposeful and specific around that. An example being, I'll give two examples. One from the disability world is we've set up a network of clubs called Core Inclusive Clubs. These are mainly in mainstream netball clubs that run sessions throughout the week, different age groups, different leagues and things. However, once a month or so, maybe a little bit more frequently but mainly once a month, they will host a disability specific session. where
Okay.
people can come along and can play with their peers, have that coaching tailored to them.
Yeah.
And whilst they are entirely welcome to come to any other session, actually that specific exclusive, you might say, that exclusive session is actually the one that they come to. And so, yes, we need to make the sport more inclusive, but we also need to recognize that there are sometimes some very specific needs that need to be addressed in a very specific way. Second example of that is my role was expanded about 18 months, 2 years ago now, to add and inclusion on, which I think, as I've said before, and inclusion literally means everyone. But I've taken that in the more specific areas of looking in deprived communities and in Muslim women community. In order to engage the Muslim community, yes, we can be more inclusive in our generic back to netball sessions. But there are times when we need to be specific and to address cultural needs and to recognize the differences in order to be able to include them. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that the game that they're playing is any different. It doesn't mean that. We're not changing stuff from that perspective. But it's maybe our approach, it's maybe the environment that in order to be more user-friendly, to be more inclusive. So I think we have to do both to be successful in this area.
Danielle, I think it's really interesting. I wasn't interrogating you for any strategy writing there, but I know. But I think so. Just kind of, that inclusion is really important to me and into volunteering. And I guess there's some stuff that England Netball have done around belonging report to understand where we are now and kind of like what the landscape looks like. But also the concept of those that are already engaged, how do we know whether or not they're consciously inclusive, or any unconscious bias is a big topic that's been talked about. And I know you've been kind of involved, Rich, and then you've picked up, Danielle, quite a lot of the conscious inclusion stuff that England Netball have started to roll out to support those consider that as a topic. So just talk to us a little bit about that, and also how we mitigate the fear in some of the discomfort that comes with sometimes the reality that we might not be as inclusive as we are, and how we support people to feel comfortable with being uncomfortable, as long as it's kind of driving positive change.
Twofold. I mean, people don't know what they don't know, for a start. So that it sounds, just a throwaway comment, but it is absolutely true. You don't know what you're missing out, what you're not seeing, or where your gaps are, unless they're pointed out to you. And the first, Emma, what was the first bit point that
the conscious inclusion training, like that was the response to the belonging report, and a supportive free training tool for volunteers, or just generally people in netball, to be more inclusive or aware.
So England Netball did an amazing piece of work. The conscious inclusion training is brilliant, and in terms of the fact that we used local netballers, we used real people. It was recorded, there's a video, it's modules, you go through it, it's really accessible, it's really easy to use, and it starts to provide you with, it's thought provoking, and it starts to makes you think about maybe some of your unconscious bias and some of the things that you might think. It's in a very specific setting. It's netball on the court, and what happens. And obviously there's
been any negative pushback to that kind of approach, because it can, making people feel uncomfortable can cause them to react in a way that make, when they're uncomfortable, that they can be negative. What's been the general sense, and has there been anything negative back against it?
The honest answer for me is I haven't been there long enough to know. But
fair enough.
But no, not from those who probably feel like they needed a bit of info. And it's easy, Chris. You're watching something on your own with your headphones on. You feel really comfortable on your own. Yeah. You're not in a group or being put on the spot. Yeah. You're just watching training. So no. And those people who feel like they might need something, or it might be a bit useful, probably have really enjoyed it and got something out of it. Those who are probably work within this space, or are just a little bit more clued up when it comes to some of the challenges and the barriers that are in place, may have felt slightly differently. Like, well, there's much more to it than that. It's only gone into a certain space.
Yeah.
So I think there'll be differences, but there's definitely a good response in terms of creating that and developing that where it's sat. And then this is where my, I guess, background and what I'm doing now, sometimes I'm finding challenging, and I'm getting there, is because in the world of business, people do what you tell them to do, almost. Obviously,
volunteers are funny like that.
Yeah, and obviously, like, you know, a leadership and cultural head on, we're not just dictating to people, and it's made that, you know, people are involved and engaged, and that they make some choices themselves. But ultimately, this is what we're driving in as an organisation. And if you're part of our organisation, this is what you do. I'm now working in an organisation with all of these amazing volunteers that drive the organisation. So when I look and say, so is everybody done this conscious? How do we know who's done it? We don't really, or, you know, do they have to do it? Not really. So for me, it's there, and there are things that are available perhaps for people to tap into if they want to. And that's where I'm having to really start to learn and want to learn more about volunteering in sport, and it for an organisation, and how, which I guess has been most, you know, one of the biggest challenges all the time. You know, how do we engage volunteers, really keep them going and motivate them to do the amazing work they're doing in the community, but also trying to instill some of our values and the things that the standards that we kind of expect. So that merge of those two things that I've mentioned, that's where I feel like I'll be challenged throughout, which are great challenges. But yeah, that's probably one of the biggest things.
I think it's really brave for a governing body to sort of take an unashamed stance on something like this, because it's as I mentioned at the start, it's easy to sort of follow the sort of social, you know, what's going on in wider society and ignore it and don't worry about it because it'll sort of, you know, it's just society. You know, sport's not there to fix this stuff. But it's quite brave for an NGB, I think, to sort of say, no, these are our values. This is what we think. This is how we think you should treat people, and this is how we want to. You know, we want to be unashamedly inclusive, sort of thing. It's you know, not necessarily all your members and all your volunteers buy into it, but at least as a sort of an NGB, you're saying this is what this is the sort of the standard we want to set, and this is the way we think people should behave towards each other. It's a subtle thing, but it's sort of you are pushing against the general culture to sort of say, no, we're holding ourselves to a higher standard than society in general. I think it's quite quite, for me, it's what sport's all about, in all honesty. But
I think, and Rich, I know we were here sort of in the development of the adventure strategy, but I think that's where, when it's really purposeful, and the purpose that's been defined in the kind of new netball adventure strategy, it's not just the governing body saying what's right. It's been informed by like hundreds of drawings from different people in the netball kind of community, or people that we've talked to about netball, that actually then were themed into common themes and threads of what people wanted the future to look like, as well as kind of, you know, thousands of opinions that have come through our different survey mechanisms that actually, certainly, and Rich, Danielle, share what you think, but I feel fundamentally the vision feels right for the sport in the country, and that's why it's so important that we drive those values to ensure that netball is a great place. And we know when netball is brilliant, the incredible things that it gives to those that are involved, you know, so women and girls can feel really safe, and that they can take part with dignity and that side of things, which is a really important part of inclusion. But then we are still kind of ensuring that we have partnerships with organisations like England Men's and Mixed Netball Association, because we can see a growing demand for the game for men as well, and it's how do we work together with others to nurture that.
I was going to ask about that, actually, because I played netball at university. We used to play against the basketball team, used to play against the netball team. So I was, you know, we talk about inclusion, but there is the massive elephant in the room that netball is very much a women's game. You know, not to get anyone in trouble or anything, just thoughts, ideas. What's the, you know, what's the we're talking about inclusion. How do you, you know, account for the other 50% of the population?
I don't think that that going into a deep philosophical debate at this stage around this, and there's so many other things. I think it's worth saying the way that I often think about it is, you know, we do have a unique selling point in netball. And also, if you think about the pound, and if you think about the pence in the pound that's gone into male sport compared to female sport, I do not have a problem in having a female first attitude in what I deliver. I don't think that answers your question directly, but that's more of a personal take. There was one thing I just wanted to come back to, was around the changing demographics of our population. We just had the census last year. We've seen how demographics have changed. And I'm from a volunteer's perspective, correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm not Imo, but certainly when it comes to a committee, I assume that the age of a committee member is older than, you know, a player, you know, that's playing competitively, and often it's a natural progression from playing to volunteering or playing to committee. And the thing that I've always held true to when I took on this new expanded role was a French philosopher, Augustus Comte. He talks about demographics is destiny, and I think that's always been really a powerful thing for me, is to really understand demographics is destiny. And when we go back to our conscious inclusion training and the stuff that we're trying to do now, it may be at that participation end of the spectrum. How, you know, my job is about how do we get more people playing sport? How do I go to new communities? How do I tackle inequalities? And I'm doing that, I suppose, much more from a player's perspective, but knowing that that is destiny. Like, if we bring them into the sport, if we are more diverse as a playing cohort in 2023, in 2043, as they progress into more of a volunteering role, our demographics is our destiny. So how do we change our demographics now? And some of the ways that we can do that is through the conscious inclusion training. And what I loved about that training was that it wasn't an off-the-shelf piece. You know, we could have done an off-the-shelf piece and just said, mandatory, as part of becoming a member, you need to go and do this exercise, tick box exercise. I was involved slightly on the periphery, but I was absolutely involved in the kind of the inception of it and the growth of it. And that was one of the things that was key to that it could not be. That is why it's in a netball setting. We recorded specifically around themes, and there's a storyline to it, which is a realistic one, actually based on real world examples that we pulled from other colleagues within our team, to be able to build a story and a narrative for people to learn and to become most impacted by that training, by creating the setting that it's in rather than doing that. Because, and I think that's where it's worked. So I think when we talk about has there been pushback, I'm sure there will have been, you know, that idea of, oh, I've got to do this thing. I didn't have to do it before. Now I've got to do it. However, actually, when you get to the end of that training, to me, what's your feeling then as an individual, as a volunteer, once you've come to the end of that training? And I would hazard a guess that
that Daily Mail woke thing that organisations are scared of being accused of these days, as if it's some kind of negative thing to be, aware of other people's feelings, is now sort of a thing we shouldn't be aspiring to. So, Rich, first time ever on the podcast anyone's referred to a French philosopher, so you definitely get a gold star for that one. And then your second gold star is for the fact that your next strategic plan will be planning for 2047. I'm sure Sport England are going to love that strategic goal.
It's already happening, though. That's the point with this. Demographics is destiny. It's inevitable. We are in a changing society, and we as a sport have got to change in order to mirror that society. Otherwise, we will be left behind.
Yeah,
but I think
I love that.
It comes down to, and Rich, you're right, like the demographics are usually that older individuals do volunteer because often they have the time. But I also think that kind of volunteering trends across the sector are actually showing that, because there's so much going on in the world, there's this concept of micro volunteering and how people can start to get involved and give a little bit, but they don't have to then sign their life away for a long time doing huge amounts of admin. It's kind of, how do we work together with volunteers to look at that offer that is inclusive, so that people, if you don't have time or you perceive you don't have time, actually we can offer more bite-sized opportunities that you can make a difference. And just because you're not giving 10 hours a day, like there are some incredible volunteers that literally they give their life to the sport, and we are incredibly lucky because of that commitment. But that shouldn't be the ultimate.
The
we
measure.
Need to have
we measure success.
That is, you know, an individual who's chosen to commit their days, their weeks, their life to the sport, and that is hugely valued. But it is also valued if you want to be there for half an hour. You know, Chris, I know that I volunteered to do this with you, and you're very kind that I just go sometimes, right, you're not top of my list, right, I've got to do the job.
Don't take it personally,
You know,
all
but I feel like that's about the kind of partnership of understanding with each other around the boundaries of, you know, what you are giving and utilizing skills. And Danielle, where you talked a little bit about, you know, you feel that sense of belonging when you feel you can sort of see what you are. But I think there's that massive element of actually embracing difference and enjoying hearing difference of opinion, and actually having that makes us more successful as a sport and as a society, in my opinion.
I definitely want to come back to this belonging, because you know, it's a doing word, belonging. It's not a management term. It's an emotional sense of being, and I think it's so interesting. You got it in your job title to generate this sense of belonging. I think it's real nod to one of the things that's missing in as society is becoming more and more individualistic, and people are becoming more and more about their own existence. You know, there is sort of going philosophical again. There is a tension in society of we're being pulled more towards this individualistic sort of state of being, and people are more concerned about them and what they consume and what they do. And you know that's reflected in there's a reduction in trust within our wider society, and these intangible but really important things that hold communities together. And to see the role of sport acknowledging the importance of belonging is, again, I think it's a really, really positive and really interesting approach. And you know, this getting people involved as volunteers is part of this wider idea of creating a community and asking people to do things that they may not necessarily get any direct benefit from for the wider group is this sense that it's part of this building of trust in the communities that the people are part of. You know, doing it alongside people they wouldn't normally be working alongside, very different people from different age profiles. All these kind of things are essential to a healthy civic social life for me. And I'm intrigued, Danielle, as to where you see belonging. You know, it's part of your job title. How does it manifest itself in your day-to-day work, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, gosh, you made so many points there that I wanted to chirp in and interrupt.
You need to stop me talking.
I mean, for each of us on this call now, it means something different for each of us. So it can also be the layers of it are also different. So you can belong in one group because they are. So, for example, I use a personal example. My daughter plays netball and basketball. Netball, they're all girls and they're predominantly white. She's black. In basketball, they're all boys and they're all black, Asian, non-white. 7 different languages.
Yep.
Kids run off the court to go and pray. No one thinks about it. No one thinks twice. There's children who come and play in their older brother's trainers because they can't afford kit. There's kids with disabilities. So it's a complete group of kids that run up and down, that are from completely diverse backgrounds and come together. And I've asked Ella this question, my daughter, quite a few times about this sense of belonging while I'm navigating the world, and we all are. Where does she feel like she belongs the most? And she really struggles to answer that question, because on one side it's girls, like, come on, I'm a girl, like girl power, like she wants to be with the girls and talk about the things that girls talk about and do all of that stuff. And starting year 7, it's all exciting being a girl when you're 12. For some girls it is, not for all. But then she's with this group where other girls look like her. They can talk about their hair braided, they can talk about the food they eat, they can relax and be who they are at home in that space on the basketball court. The language that they use, their whole culture is with them there, and she doesn't leave any of that behind, that she probably does, like subconsciously, definitely subconsciously, when she's at netball. I see 2 different children, really, not fundamentally different, but in terms of her outward kind of approach. And so I think when we're thinking about belonging, it's sometimes about the head that we put on in that moment as individuals into the space that we're going in, to say, actually, I belong, that part of me belongs there. But actually on another day, in another time, that part of me belongs in that group. Yeah. And then there are some people that would suggest that actually the whole of me, I feel like I belong, I want to be with that group because I really belong, and I can bring my whole self to that. And that's what's important to that group. So that sense of belonging, and all the work that I've done over my years in anything, it's all been people. Is all about understanding what it means to other people before we can give people something that's going to make them feel like they belong. So in the different groups that we'll be working with across the different minority groups, and I don't know what's going to make everybody feel like they belong, and we know we're never going to know that, but there has to be a fundamental standard. And I think it's interesting because one of the mums at the netball club that I coach at and play at, she always does like the social stuff for the girls because her daughter plays on the same team. And I said to her, so like you thank you for volunteering. It's amazing that you've done that. And she was like, well, I'm just getting, I didn't have to do much. I was just doing, and I'm a volunteer. And she felt, and I was like, well, of course, like you've done this for us 4 times since September. You've done all the arranging, gathered all the money in, got everybody where they need to be. You are volunteering, and to give up your time to help that, something the girls really want to do. And she felt so proud. She felt so proud that she'd done that, and that actually she could call herself a volunteer rather than it felt proactive then for her, like a thing to do that was helping, as opposed to just, oh, I'll do that. And so we set her up with a couple of the other WhatsApp groups of the other age groups of the mums that do the same. And now they've got this little volunteer network. And she actually said to me, I really feel like I belong in that group. Nice. And that's me and my personal time. That's not work. I'm not like, who's belonging out there? Like when I'm out, like everybody, can you feel like you belong? That's just me on my like Tuesday night at training with my daughter.
It's nice to see you live and breathe it. It's not
well,
just talking the talk on a Friday 9 to 5.
But to hear her say that, and I just thought, what a great anecdote and example to bring back to work, and to think about that person, even though it was kind of off her own, and I did kind of hook her up with the other group and say the word volunteering, but if it wasn't me, other people I guess would have. But she was like, I just really feel like I belong in that group. It's brilliant. I'm so happy, and I've forged friendships, Yeah,
it's for me, it feels like netball have sort of got their head around this idea, organizational sort of empathy, that there's at least, they're not always going to get it right, but at least they're thinking about it, and they're trying to, sometimes trying to do something is as important as actually doing it at all. Having a go at being empathetic and understanding people's needs, and
the intentions are there. The intention,
yeah, exactly. You don't always, with best intention in the world, you certainly don't always get it right, but at least there's a fundamentally good intention behind what you're trying to do, and there's some thought being put into it. It'll be interesting in our next podcast when we speak to someone at the board level, Imo, as to if it's reflected at that level in some of the other NGBs that he's worked with. We'll note that for a question to ask.
But I think it's really important. I think like people-centered, and we have been really good over the past 10 years around kind of like putting the participant at the heart of everything, to make sure that the offers for netball engage them through things like walking netball that's gone out, that really appeals to kind of like women,
more inclusive, broader,
that netball doesn't always work in its form, so how do we adapt the game to kind of support the different groups? And I mean, Danielle and Rich can share, but I genuinely feel we are trying to mirror that care for the people, because we know the two are intrinsically linked, but it's really hard, and I don't think it's a set blueprint or path, and I don't think we haven't progressed forward in the world of volunteering, because I don't think we've ever really, really genuinely and authentically cared about it. It's been utilizing, and that's not from a netball point of view. I think netball have cared, but I don't think we've collectively cared and considered the people who give their time. In sport in particular, we've just let them get on and do it, and we've never thought, well, what do they need? How do we make sure they're looked after, and that kind of are aware of what they don't know and those things, and supported. So as I think both have said, every day is a learning day. Hey, I feel like, and sometimes we go down a route and then we go, nah, that's not going to work. We need to think about how to differently, but we're open to change, and we're open to challenge. That would be my takeaway of where we're at.
Well, I'm just aware that we're very much coming to the end of our hour together. It's been lovely just speaking to you both. Imo's got she loves a two from you, so I'm gonna hand you over Timo, and she's got a little final challenge for you both.
You know, I love these things. Don't.
Well, we love a challenge because Rich and I played netball against each other on Tuesday, and
won.
I'm never playing against him again.
Well, Danielle, you call it a challenge. That's your words, not mine.
Oh God! Right. So let's finish on 2 from you, and I'll tell you what 2 from you is. So it's one word from your professional kind of experience of volunteering, and one word from your personal world of volunteering that you feel sum up volunteering for you professionally or personally. So what 2 words would you bring to the table? One from your kind of lens through work, and one through your kind of personal volunteer journeys that would summarize what volunteering means to you.
Professionally, I'd say straight away, I think inspirational. Like, I'm just in awe of the volunteers at work and that I've worked around over the years. Personally, you see, the volunteering that I've done, I guess active volunteering that I get my family, like that we do every year, you know, and that was something I would have actually got onto. It's really important, I think, that it becomes part of what we do. You mentioned, Chris, about sharing, and other people actually have got a focus on themselves at the moment in society. It seems to be going down that way, and I'm really conscious that my children are aware of what volunteering we're going to do this year, what are we interested in, who can we help, like that it's just a natural thing. So we've done, you know, soup kitchens and things in hospitals and presents and those types of things that we've done, not necessarily in sport, though my daughter's now on the volunteer set up with England Netball. I don't know. So personally, so many different words come, and I think gratitude might be my personal one.
Oh, that was my professional one, Danielle.
No,
that was my professional one. And I was
It's always terrible going second, Rich. That's the problem.
Well, I know, but Danielle seemed to have quite a few words there, not two words. But my professional one was going to be gratitude, because I think there's just, we've spoken about it a little bit, but without volunteers in sport, not just netball, just doesn't run. And, you know, what is it, 3.8 roles per volunteer or something like that, Imo? I seem to remember in meetings you chirping on about, but that gratitude is
he did say that.
But it's genuine, isn't it? It's a genuine gratitude in order to do that. And from a personal point of view, I think it's opportunity, like the opportunities that I've been afforded because of volunteering, the places that I've been, the people that I've met, the travel that I've had, the worlds that I've seen, has just made me a more well-rounded and I think better at my job. So my personal has absolutely impacted my professional when it comes to it. So we'll have that linking word of grateful from Danielle and I. But for me, from a personal point of view, it's that opportunity that it's afforded me is something which, money can't buy, literally.
Yeah.
Love that.
Love
Great
that.
one there.
Amazing.
Well done, you two. We like them. We like them ones.
Yeah, they're really good. Well, and I'm really proud to work with you both, and I'm really grateful for the passion that you have for volunteers, for us to kind of get this right. So thanks for coming on the show. But I feel like there's another 4 or 5 episodes in some of the content here. So I feel like this is the start of the journey, right?
For the next thing.
Will you come back?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys so much for your time, and good luck with everything you're doing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to you both for what you're doing and for this podcast. Thank you.